The encounter at AUM Boutique. Merera O'Neal stepped out of her car, the Los Angeles traffic humming in the distance, but it might as well have been a world away. The soft, rhythmic thrum of her heartbeat was all she could hear as she adjusted her sunglasses against the fierce Californian sun. She had parked a block away from AUM, the prestigious boutique in one of the city's most fashionable districts, and she stood for a moment, taking it all in. The air was heavy with the distinct scent of LA, a combination of saltwater, pavement, and a hint of expensive perfume from the high-end stores that lined the street. A breeze stirred through the palm trees, sending a few loose leaves spiraling in the air before they gently landed at her feet. Merera inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had driven here alone. Alone, because her father's presence would only cloud what she had come to do. Alone, because today, she wasn't just the daughter of Shaquille O'Neal. She was Merera, an individual with her own dreams, her own purpose, and her own identity. A name that didn't only come from the shadow of her legendary father. The boutique stood before her like a towering monument to wealth and status. It glimmered under the Californian sun, all sharp angles and modern glass. The name, AUM, was etched in delicate gold lettering on the front window, offering a glimpse into the rarefied world within. Inside, mannequins stood like silent sentinels, draped in gowns that screamed sophistication and exclusivity. Merera hesitated, standing outside just long enough to gather her thoughts. She had come for one reason, to find the perfect dress for her high school's winter formal. Not just any dress, but one that would make a statement. It would be her moment to step out of the shadow of being Shaquille O'Neal's daughter and step into the light as Merera O'Neal, an individual with her own worth. A moment for her to be seen for who she truly was, not just the child of someone famous. She pushed open the door, and the soft chime that followed felt almost too loud in the quiet of the boutique. The air was cool, almost sterile, and it smelled faintly of floral notes mixed with something citrusy, a scent that seemed too expensive to be real, too perfect to exist in any other world but this one. The polished white marble floors gleamed beneath the overhead lights, their cold reflection casting a soft glow that illuminated the delicate clothing racks dotted across the space. Merera took a step forward, her sneakers scraping against the marble floor as she moved further into the boutique. She was acutely aware of the soft stares of the employees scattered around the space, their gazes sharp, cold, and calculating. A few glanced at her, then quickly turned away, dismissing her almost immediately. Their judgment hung in the air like an invisible weight. She swallowed, reminding herself that she was here for a purpose. She would not let herself be intimidated. Her mind steadied as she walked past the shimmering racks of couture gowns. Her track suit and sneakers felt out of place, sure. But she refused to let that be a reason to retreat. She was here to find something for herself, not to conform to anyone's expectations. Her father had always taught her to be proud of who she was, no matter where she stood or how different she looked. Behind the counter stood Jessica Marlowe, a striking figure who almost looked too polished to be real. Tall, lean, and dressed in a tailored black blazer and pencil skirt, she had the air of someone who spent her days amongst the elite. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, the edges sharp and precise. Her name tag read Jessica Marlowe in small, elegant print. Merera couldn't help but notice how cold her gaze was as it swept over her. "Can I help you with something?" Jessica's voice was cool, her tone polite but laced with an unmistakable undertone of disinterest. Merera hesitated for just a moment before speaking. "I'm looking for a dress for my high school's winter formal," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Something unique, something that stands out." Jessica's lips curved into a thin smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, her gaze lingering on Merera's sneakers for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sure we can find something for you." Merera followed Jessica through the boutique, feeling the weight of her gaze the entire time. Her shoes squeaked slightly on the floor, and every step felt like it echoed in the quiet, sterile space. She was acutely aware of how she didn't fit in here, how her clothes were a stark contrast to the glossy, designer-clad clientele that usually roamed these halls. Jessica led her to a back corner of the boutique, where the most exclusive gowns were displayed. The lighting in this section was dimmer, more atmospheric, and the garments were even more extravagant than those in the front of the store. Some were sequined, others velvet, all shimmering under the soft light. They looked more like sculptures than dresses, impossibly delicate and beautiful. "These are our latest arrivals," Jessica said, her voice now tinged with a hint of pride. "I'm sure you'll find something here that suits your taste." Merera ran her fingers lightly over the fabric of one dress, admiring its intricate design. She wasn't sure yet if any of these dresses would be the one, but she kept moving, inspecting each garment with a growing sense of disappointment. Nothing felt right. The dresses, while beautiful, felt like they belonged to someone else, someone with a different kind of life, a different kind of world. Her mind wandered back to her high school, to her peers, to the formal. She didn't want to stand out in the wrong way. She didn't want to be the daughter of Shaquille O'Neal. She wanted to be seen for her own accomplishments. The dress had to embody that: confidence, individuality, strength. Just as she was about to walk to another section of the boutique, her hand brushed against one of the nearby racks, causing a few dresses to tumble to the floor with a soft rustling sound. Merera bent down quickly to gather them up, her heart racing in embarrassment. She hadn't meant to cause a mess, but as she bent to pick up the fallen gowns, she heard Jessica's sharp, clipped voice behind her. "You know, you're really making a mess of things." Jessica's tone was so condescending that it sent a cold shiver down Merera's spine. "Maybe this place isn't for you." Merera froze. For a brief moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. She stood up slowly, collecting herself, and turned to face Jessica. The woman's eyes were narrowed in silent judgment, and her lips curled into a slight sneer. Merera knew she should walk away, leave this place behind, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Never let anyone make you feel small." In a calm, steady voice, Merera responded, her gaze never wavering. "You don't know who I am." Jessica's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, clearly perplexed. Merera took a deep breath. She could feel the heat of anger building in her chest, but she knew she had to stay composed. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal's daughter." There was a long pause. Jessica blinked, processing the information. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, as though she had misjudged Merera entirely. But then, without warning, Jessica stepped forward, her hand slapping Merera across the cheek with a sharp crack. The sting of the slap burned, and for a moment, all Merera could do was stand there, stunned. "You don't belong here," Jessica sneered, her words venomous. "People like you never do." Merera's world seemed to pause in that moment. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples. The sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the sting of those words. But then something shifted. Something inside her clicked. Without another word, she straightened her shoulders and met Jessica's gaze with newfound clarity. "You don't know who you're messing with," Merera said, her voice calm but full of power. As she turned to walk out of the boutique, her hand instinctively moved to her cheek, but the pain was already fading. Her heart pounded with a mix of anger and resolve, but it was the feeling of liberation that took root deep inside her. This was her moment. The world would know her name, not because of her father, but because of who she was becoming. Jessica Marlowe had just made a mistake. A big one. And Merera knew it, the unexpected consequences. Merera's footsteps echoed through the boutique as she walked toward the door, the sting of Jessica's slap still fresh on her cheek. She kept her head high, her eyes fixed ahead. But inside, her emotions churned like a storm. How dare Jessica treat her like that? How dare anyone assume they had the right to disrespect her because of her appearance, her clothes, or the name she carried. The boutique door swung open with a soft chime as she stepped into the bright Californian sunlight. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The bustling city streets, the cars zipping past, the chatter of pedestrians, it all faded into the background. All that existed in her world, for the briefest of moments, was the raw, intense feeling of being wronged. Merera stood still, breathing deeply. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. One moment, she was browsing through dresses, and the next, she was slapped in the face by a woman who had no idea who she was, or rather, who she wasn't. She didn't know what had come over her, but as soon as the slap hit, something inside her had snapped. She wasn't going to cower. She wasn't going to let this woman or anyone else define her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She pulled it out, hoping for a distraction. It was a message from her best friend, Nina. "How's the dress shopping going?" Merera stared at the text for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. What was she going to say? The truth felt too complicated, too raw. Nina had no idea what she'd just endured. She had no idea about the slap. Merera paused, wiping a single tear that had fallen without her realizing, and typed a quick reply. "It's fine. Just trying to find the right one. I'll tell you about it later." She hit send and slid the phone back into her pocket, knowing she couldn't share the full story yet. Not like this. Not when she was still processing everything. Merera walked a few more steps, her pace slow, as if each movement had to be deliberate, each thought a conscious effort. She'd never been slapped like that before, not in such a public, calculated way. The sting on her face had faded, but the hurt from Jessica's words, the implications of them, lingered. As she turned the corner onto a quieter street, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from her father. She smiled despite herself, knowing he had a way of sensing when something wasn't right, even when he was miles away. His protective instincts were always a little too sharp for her liking, but today, it felt like she needed him. "Mera, are you okay? Just checking in. Let me know if you need anything. I'm here for you." Her heart skipped a beat. Her father. The man who could block shots and dunk on giants. The man who was known for his massive physical presence and intimidating demeanor. But to her, he was just Dad, the man who always knew how to make her feel safe, no matter what storm was raging around her. She typed back quickly. "Yeah, I'm good. Just had a run-in with a snobby boutique manager, but it's fine." She didn't want to worry him. He had enough on his plate with his various business ventures, charity work, and the legacy he was constantly trying to uphold. But there was something about his presence in her life, even through a text message, that made her feel grounded again. "You know where to find me if you need anything. Don't let anyone bring you down." She stared at the words for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard as she fought the urge to tell him everything. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. Not when the situation was so raw. So personal. Merera let out a deep breath and decided to keep walking. There was a quiet park nearby, a place where she could collect her thoughts. She didn't want to go back to her car and drive away just yet. Not after what had happened. She needed a moment to herself, away from the polished world of AUM and the woman who had dared to slap her. The park was a peaceful oasis in the middle of the bustling city. Trees lined the walking paths, casting long shadows on the ground. The sound of children playing in the distance mixed with the occasional chirp of a bird. Merera found an empty bench and sat down, letting the cool breeze brush against her skin. The sun hung low in the sky now, casting a golden glow over the park. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm that still raged inside her. She hadn't wanted to be confrontational today. She had wanted to walk into the boutique, pick out a dress, and leave with a smile, not with the bitter taste of humiliation lingering in her mouth. But as much as she hated the way it happened, a part of her felt liberated. Jessica had tried to knock her down, to belittle her, and Merera had stood tall. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't let the woman push her into the mold she had expected. Instead, she had found her voice. She had spoken up. And that felt like victory in itself. But even as she reflected on that moment, she knew there were consequences to this. Jessica hadn't just slapped her, she had humiliated her in a way that left a mark. And although Merera had held her ground, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Jessica speak to her again the next time they crossed paths? Would she try to make it right? Or would Merera become a target, someone to be avoided, to be ostracized for not knowing her place in this world of luxury and status? She shook her head. No, she wouldn't let it go that far. She wouldn't let someone like Jessica dictate her life. Not now, not ever. As she sat there, a thought crossed her mind: what would the public think if they found out? Her father's name, while a blessing, could also be a curse. It could mean that everything she did was scrutinized, every move she made twisted into something else. Would people assume she had caused the altercation? Would the media twist the story to make her look like the problem, the bratty daughter of a famous athlete? A sudden rush of adrenaline surged through her as the thought of the media's reaction made her stomach churn. But no matter how much it bothered her, she knew she had no control over what people thought. What mattered was what she thought, what she believed about herself. And right now, she felt proud of who she was. She stood up from the bench, the weight of her thoughts settling into a quiet sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let anyone, make her feel small. Not Jessica, not anyone in the boutique, not the people who would judge her from the outside. She was more than what they saw, and she would keep proving that, no matter what. With one last glance at the park, Merera walked away, her steps firm and confident, knowing that her journey was just beginning. The ripple effect. Merera couldn't shake the feeling of unease as she made her way back home. The park had given her a moment of clarity, a space to breathe and think, but now, as the streets of Los Angeles stretched before her, the weight of what had happened lingered. The slap. The humiliation. The feeling of being dismissed by someone she'd never even met before. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, Jessica's cold, calculating stare, the venom in her voice, and the sting of the slap that had left a red mark across her cheek. She could still feel the sensation, as though the sound of it had echoed inside her mind, bouncing between her thoughts, making her heart race every time she recalled it. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her reverie. It was another text from Nina. Merera, I was just thinking, maybe we can go dress shopping together sometime soon? Just let me know, smiley face. Merera smiled, typing a quick response. Thanks, Nina, I'll let you know. I just need to figure things out on my own today. She wasn't ready to share the details with her best friend yet, not about what had happened at AUM, not about the way she had been treated. Nina wouldn't understand. Not in the way Merera needed her to. The dynamic between them was different. Nina was a friend, but she didn't carry the weight that Merera did. She wasn't constantly reminded of who her father was and how people treated her because of it. As she pulled up into her driveway, Merera saw her father's SUV parked outside the house. A wave of both relief and dread washed over her. The house was quiet, and the sun had just started to set, casting a soft orange glow over the front lawn. When she stepped inside, she was met with the familiar warmth of home, a place that had always felt like a safe haven. Her father's voice came from the kitchen, a low rumble that carried through the house. Merera. You're back. How's everything going? Shaquille O'Neal's booming voice could always make her feel both at ease and a little overwhelmed, depending on the context. But today, she didn't have the energy to face him just yet. I'm fine, Dad. Just needed to clear my head, Merera said, offering a weak smile as she made her way into the living room. Shaquille emerged from the kitchen, his towering frame filling the doorway. He was dressed casually in a basketball hoodie and sweatpants, his usual relaxed style when he wasn't out in public. His broad face softened when he saw her, concern etching his features as he took in her expression. "Something's bothering you," he said, his tone calm but knowing. Merera sighed, sinking into the couch. She could never hide anything from him. The man had eyes like a hawk, able to read people with uncanny precision. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. "It's nothing," she started, her voice shaky. "Just some stuff at the boutique. It's not a big deal." Her father sat down beside her, the couch groaning under his weight. He didn't press her immediately, but the quiet understanding in his eyes made her want to tell him everything. And yet, she hesitated. She didn't want him to swoop in, to be her protector. She didn't want to feel weak. She wanted to handle this on her own. But as the minutes passed, she found herself unable to keep it in. She told him about about Jessica, and about the slap. The words spilled out before she could stop them, each sentence tumbling over the next in a rush of emotions that she hadn't even realized were building up inside her. Shaquille didn't interrupt. He didn't ask a single question while she spoke. He simply listened, his gaze steady, his presence calm as she poured out everything, the anger, the embarrassment, the frustration. Finally, when she finished, he exhaled, his jaw tight. "That's a whole lot to take in," he said slowly, his voice low but full of weight. Merera looked at him, her chest tight. She knew he was disappointed that someone had treated her like that, but she wasn't sure if he was more concerned for her or for the image that had been tarnished. After all, he was the one who had built a legacy over decades. He had worked hard to cultivate an image of success, not just for himself but for his family. Merera had grown up in that shadow, and while she never resented it, she also knew it came with its own set of expectations. "You know, kid," Shaquille said after a long pause, his voice thick with emotion, "people like that, they don't know the real you. They don't know the strength you carry. And when someone does something like that, it's not a reflection of you, it's a reflection of them. They're the ones who look small. You were strong. You didn't let them break you." Merera felt a lump form in her throat. She had been expecting a lecture, something more along the lines of how she should have handled it differently. But this? This was different. It was exactly what she needed to hear. "I just don't know if it's worth it, Dad," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I want to keep putting myself in situations where people treat me like that just because of who I am. I'm not just your daughter, you know." Shaquille looked at her, his face softening. He took a deep breath, then placed a large hand on her shoulder. "I know you're not just my daughter. But whether you like it or not, that's part of who you are. And it doesn't make you less of a person. In fact, it gives you power, because you have the choice to show people who you really are. The world might think they know you, but they don't. They can't. And that's where your strength lies." Merera felt a sudden rush of clarity. Her father had always told her that power wasn't just about physical strength or fame, it was about owning who you were, being unapologetic about it. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly, looking up at him. I don't want to let it define me. I want to be more than that." "You will be," Shaquille said firmly. "You already are. And if anyone tries to make you feel otherwise, you stand tall. Show them who you really are, just like you did today. Don't let them get to you." Merera smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't an easy smile, but it was a genuine one. Her father had given her the kind of advice she needed to hear, the kind that made her feel like she could take on the world, no matter what anyone threw at her. As she stood up to leave, she felt a sense of resolve settling over her. She wasn't going to let one woman's narrow-mindedness dictate her future. She wasn't going to let the world define her based on her last name or her appearance. She was Merera O'Neal, unique, powerful, and unapologetically herself. And from that moment on, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. The turning point. The days following the incident at AUM were a blur for Merera. She kept herself busy with school, her extracurriculars, and the quiet space she had carved out for herself in her home. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her studies or escape into her hobbies, her mind kept returning to that moment. The slap. The humiliation. The feeling of being underestimated by someone she didn't even know. The sting on her cheek had long since faded, but the wound in her heart lingered. Jessica's words had been the ones that hurt the most, more than the physical blow. "You don't belong here." Those words echoed in her mind at the strangest times, as though they were a constant reminder that no matter how hard she tried, there would always be people who judged her. Who saw her only for what she represented, not for who she was. Her father had offered her comfort, telling her to rise above it, but Merera knew that it wasn't always that simple. The truth was, she was tired. Tired of the assumptions people made about her because of her last name. Tired of the way society expected her to be just like her father, larger than life, always in the spotlight. She wasn't him. She never would be. Yet, she realized something else during those long days of reflection: she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. The fact that she hadn't let Jessica's cruel words break her was proof of that. She had stood tall, even when she wanted to shrink away. And that strength, quiet, unassuming, but undeniable, was hers to wield. It was early one Saturday morning when everything changed. Merera was still at home, curled up on the couch with a book, when she heard a knock at the door. Her father was away on business, and her mom had stepped out for errands, so she wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see a woman standing there, holding a clipboard and dressed in business attire. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she wore glasses that gave her a sophisticated, no-nonsense air. "Are you Merera O'Neal?" the woman asked, her tone polite but with a professional edge. "Yes, I am," Merera replied, suddenly feeling a sense of unease. The woman smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Clara Hughes, head of public relations at AUM Boutique. I'm here to speak with you about an unfortunate incident that occurred a few days ago." Merera felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly what the woman was referring to. The slap. The scene in the boutique. She had expected something like this to happen, some kind of public apology or attempt to smooth things over. What she hadn't expected was the cold formality in Clara's demeanor. This wasn't an apology. This was business. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in discussing anything further with AUM, Merera said, trying to keep her voice steady. Clara's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "I understand. But this is not just a personal matter. We are concerned about the potential fallout for the store. It's important to address this publicly." Merera's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean by fallout?" Clara's expression hardened. "We understand that you're the daughter of Shaquille O'Neal. And while that may seem like an irrelevant detail to you, it is not to the rest of the world. This could affect our image, our reputation. We would like to work with you to resolve this in a way that benefits both of us." Merera felt her blood pressure rise. She could tell where this was going, and she didn't like it. AUM wasn't concerned about what had happened to her. They were concerned about how her father's name would affect their brand. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and suddenly, she was back in that boutique, with all the assumptions, the judgments, and the cold stares. "I didn't ask for any of this," Merera said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I didn't ask to be treated like that, and I don't need AUM's apology. I don't need anyone trying to clean up their mess just because my father's famous. I'm not a pawn in your PR game." Clara's face hardened, but there was a flicker of something else, maybe respect, maybe frustration, behind her professional mask. I understand that you're upset, but I suggest you think about your reputation as well. You are in control here, Merera. And we can help you make this go away, if you're willing to work with us. Merera crossed her arms, refusing to let the woman's words affect her. My reputation is not something you can control. And if I'm going to handle this, I'll do it on my own terms. Not because you want to save face. Clara seemed to hesitate, as though weighing her options. Finally, she nodded stiffly. I see. We'll respect your decision. But understand this, you're making a choice that could have consequences. There's a lot of attention on you now. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the driveway as she left. Merera stood there, her heart pounding, but a part of her felt something she hadn't felt in days, clarity. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her how to handle her own story. She was in control now. Not Aum, not Jessica, and certainly not the public. As the door clicked shut behind her, Merera took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had a choice to make now. She could let this situation go, let it fade into the background like so many other stories of entitlement and celebrity. Or she could take a stand, turn this moment of humiliation into something bigger. Something that could change how people saw her, not as Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, but as Merera, strong, independent, and unapologetically herself. She knew what she had to do. The following week was a blur of decisions, both personal and public. Merera had always shied away from the spotlight, preferring to stay in the background, where she could simply be herself. But the world had a way of forcing her into its narrative, whether she liked it or not. So she decided to flip the script. She called a press conference. Not to talk about what had happened at Aum, but to take control of her own story. To tell the world who she was, what she stood for, and how she wasn't going to let anyone define her based on her last name. She wasn't just Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, she was Merera O'Neal, and she was ready to show the world what that truly meant. The media was skeptical at first, unsure of what to expect. They were used to hearing stories of celebrity children who either tried to ride the coattails of their famous parents or rebelled against them in dramatic fashion. But Merera was different. She didn't need to be anyone else. She didn't need to apologize for who she was. She was ready to be herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. As the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, Merera stood tall, unshaken. She had found her voice. The public eye. The press conference was nothing like Merera had anticipated. She had imagined something small, private even, where she could simply speak her truth without the overwhelming pressure of cameras and microphones. But of course, the world had other plans. Within hours of her announcement, the story had spread like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and online forums were buzzing with anticipation. Merera O'Neal, daughter of basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal, was about to speak her truth, and the world wanted to hear it. She stood behind the podium, her heart pounding in her chest as reporters crowded before her, eager to capture every word. The bright lights of the cameras made her feel as though she was being scrutinized by thousands of eyes, but she refused to let the pressure get to her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. "Thank you for coming today," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she'd been holding inside. "I know a lot of you are here because of the incident at Aum, and I'll address that in a moment. But before I do, I want to tell you who I really am." There was a slight pause as Merera surveyed the room. The reporters shifted in their seats, some adjusting their recorders, others tapping away on their phones. The tension in the air was palpable. They didn't know what to expect, but they knew this was going to be a story worth covering. "My name is Merera O'Neal, and I am more than the daughter of a famous man," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've spent my life living in the shadow of my father, a man who's known around the world for his achievements, his generosity, and his legacy. But there's a part of me that is often overlooked, the part that is just me. A young woman trying to find her way in a world that has already decided who I am before I even had the chance to figure it out. The room was silent now, save for the faint clicking of cameras. Moreira's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, slowly sinking into the minds of those who were listening. She had said it, the truth. She wasn't just a side note in her father's story. She had a story of her own, and she was ready to share it. I'm not a celebrity. I don't want to be a spectacle, and I don't want my worth to be defined by who my father is. I want to be known for my own achievements, for who I am, not for what my last name represents. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some reporters leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the shift in tone. This wasn't a typical celebrity statement. This wasn't a press conference about damage control or cleaning up a mess. Moreira was speaking her truth, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic. I don't expect everyone to understand that, she continued, her voice becoming more impassioned with each word. But I will not stand by and let anyone make me feel small. Not because of my father, not because of how I look, and certainly not because of what people think I should be. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The audience was hanging on to every syllable, but Moreira knew this was only the beginning. What came next would determine whether her message resonated or faded into obscurity. The incident at what happened to me there, is not about me being the daughter of Shaquille O'Neal, she said, her voice suddenly sharp with clarity. It's about the way society expects people like me, people who look like me, to act. To dress a certain way, to conform to the image that's been constructed for us. But I am not a stereotype. I am a person. I am an individual with my own thoughts, dreams, and aspirations. And I deserve the same respect as anyone else. A few reporters exchanged glances. Moreira could sense the shift in the room. What had started as skepticism was now being replaced with something else, perhaps respect, perhaps admiration. She wasn't just talking about herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been judged based on their appearance, their background, or the expectations others had placed on them. I know people will have opinions, she said, her voice softening as she met the eyes of the reporters. I know there will be those who will try to tear me down, to undermine my character because of who my father is. But I'm not here to fight that. I'm here to be me. The real me. And if that offends anyone, that's not my problem. Moreira took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling a sense of release as the words left her lips. She had said everything she needed to say. There was nothing more to hide. I am Moreira O'Neal, she concluded, her voice unwavering. And I will not let anyone define who I am or what I am worth. Not now, not ever. The room was silent for a moment, and then, as though on cue, the reporters erupted into questions. Hands shot up from every direction, eager to know more, to ask her about her future plans, her ambitions, her thoughts on the incident. But Moreira had already said everything she needed to say. She wasn't going to be a puppet for anyone's agenda. She was in control of her story now. As the questions flew at her, she smiled inwardly. She had taken the first step toward freedom, the freedom to be herself, without the weight of expectations bearing down on her every move. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. The world would continue to try to box her in, label her, and judge her. But she was ready to fight back. Not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet power that came from standing in her truth. When the press conference ended, Moreira stepped away from the podium, her heart still racing but filled with an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had taken control of her narrative. The days of hiding behind her father's name were over. Outside, the crowd of reporters and cameras gathered around, but Moreira didn't look back. She walked past them, head held high, knowing that this was just the beginning. As she got into her car and drove home, her phone buzzed with notifications. The world had been listening, and they were talking. The headlines were already starting to roll in. Merera O'Neal speaks out, the daughter of Shaq is ready to define her own path. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Embracing the journey. The days that followed the press conference were a whirlwind. Merera's name was everywhere, on news sites, in online discussions, and across social media platforms. People were talking, some with admiration and others with criticism. But for the first time, she felt a sense of power in being seen, in being heard. It wasn't about the fame or the attention, it was about the fact that her voice, her true voice, had reached the world. She had made a statement. The world was no longer allowed to define her based on who her father was or what they thought she should be. But that was only the beginning. She knew that stepping into the spotlight had its costs. She had already faced the public backlash, the criticisms from people who didn't understand her journey. But those criticisms no longer mattered. The voice inside her was louder than any outside judgment. Merera spent the next few weeks focusing on herself, on what she wanted for her future. She had always lived in a world where she felt expected to follow a certain path, one that had already been paved by her father's immense legacy. But now, she was carving out a new direction, one that was uniquely her own. She threw herself into her studies, working toward getting into one of the top universities that had always seemed out of reach. For once, it wasn't about the fame or connections she could use, it was about earning her place, about proving to herself that she was more than just a daughter of. She stayed up late studying for tests, writing papers that had nothing to do with her father's empire and everything to do with her passions. She loved history and literature, and for the first time, she felt like she could focus entirely on her love for learning without the pressure of living up to expectations. She also began volunteering at a local community center, helping young girls who, like her, often felt overlooked or marginalized because of their background or appearance. It was her way of giving back, of showing others that they too could define their own path. She spoke with the girls about self-worth, about not letting the world's assumptions shape who they became. They needed someone who understood their struggles, someone who could help them see their own strength. And Merera was more than ready to be that person. But despite all the positive strides she was making, the media didn't leave her alone. Every time she turned on the TV or scrolled through social media, there was another headline, another article dissecting her life. Some of them praised her courage, while others criticized her for being too entitled, or for using her father's name to further her agenda. Merera could sense the judgment behind the words, but she refused to let it break her resolve. One evening, she was scrolling through her phone when she came across a tweet that made her stomach drop. Why is Merera O'Neal trying so hard to make a name for herself? She's not a real activist. Just another rich kid playing at being a hero. #privileged much. The tweet was from someone with a large following, and it quickly went viral. Merera's heart sank as she read the responses. Some were supportive, but most of them echoed the sentiment of the original tweet. Her efforts to carve out her own identity were nothing more than a publicity stunt. The words cut deep, even though she knew they were rooted in misunderstanding. She tossed her phone aside, pacing around her room. It was a familiar feeling, that ache in her chest, the constant reminder that she couldn't win everyone's approval. She had known that when she stepped into this new chapter of her life, it would come with growing pains. But this felt different. It felt personal. Her father had always warned her about the dangers of the public eye. He had told her that once she made the decision to step into the spotlight, she would never be able to escape it. But even then, he had always been supportive, telling her to use the attention as a platform for something meaningful. Now, as Merera stood on the edge of her own path, she realized just how true his words had been. It wasn't enough to simply exist in the public eye, she had to be vigilant, careful not to let the world twist her intentions. Merera picked up her phone again, this time with a sense of determination. She knew what she had to do. She had to respond, not to the critics, but to herself. To reaffirm the reasons why she had started this journey in the first place. She sat at her desk and began typing a message to her followers. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she finally wrote. To those who don't understand why I've chosen to speak out, thank you for giving me the space to explain. I've never asked for your approval, but I won't apologize for standing up for myself, for wanting more than what society has prescribed for me. If you think I'm privileged, then you're right. I have the privilege of choice. I have the privilege of being able to shape my own destiny. And I will keep using that privilege to make a difference in the world, no matter how small. I won't stop being who I am. And I won't let anyone tell me I'm not worthy of it. She hit send. It wasn't a response to the negativity, it was a declaration. Merera knew that some people would continue to misunderstand her, continue to judge her based on their own biases. But it didn't matter anymore. She had taken control of her narrative, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. A few days later, her phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a message from Nina. Mera, I saw your tweet. And honestly, it was powerful. You've always been so strong, but I think you've finally found your voice. I'm so proud of you. You inspire me, and I know you're going to change the world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Tears welled up in Merera's eyes as she read the message. Nina had always been there for her, and now, more than ever, her friend's words felt like a lifeline. Merera knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would continue to face criticism, continue to battle against the expectations that had been placed on her for most of her life. But she also knew that she had the strength to endure. The strength to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to hold her back. She was not her father's shadow. She was not the sum of her critics' opinions. Merera O'Neal was her own person, and she was finally beginning to live life on her own terms. She had come a long way from that young girl who had feared the spotlight, from the daughter of a legend who struggled to find her voice. Now, she was standing in the light, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And no one could take that away from her. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, Merera felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.